Okay, so that's one shape you may have. Let's take a look at another function. F of x equals x to the 4/3 power times x minus 8. So we take out our calculator because they told us to graph with a calculator. I'm going to reset my graph and my windows. Okay, and then I'm going to type in my function. Now when you're typing in this function, the way you would type it in x to the 4/3, you put an x, your exponent, and then put parentheses around 4 divided by 3. That's x to the 4/3. Okay, then we're supposed to multiply that by x minus 8. Okay, I believe that's what our function was. Let me double check. Okay, that is correct. Now notice, see how it goes down here and I can't see the bottom? I'm going to make my minimum lower. Let's say 40, just to make sure I can see the bottom. Okay, now I can see the bottom. I'm going to make this one, the maximum, a little higher too so that I can see. Okay, so here is a picture of my graph. Let's analyze the things that they wanted us to take a look at. Okay, so we need maximum and minimum points. Here's definitely a minimum point. It's not just a relative minimum that's lower than everything around it, it's also the absolute minimum. It's the very lowest place on the graph. Okay, it looks like it's at about the point 4.6 negative 26. Okay, so on our graph we have a minimum point, a low point, at 4.6 negative 26, approximately. We're approximating here. Okay, it's not just a minimum, it's an absolute minimum. It's not just lower than the points around it, it's lower than everything else on the graph. Nothing else drops below it. Now here, you might be tempted to call this a maximum point, a relative maximum, but based on the definition in your textbook, a maximum, a relative maximum, has to be higher than the points both to the left and to the right of it. It has to have points on both sides. And see how this, because of the domain, stops right here at 0. Okay, it can't, they don't consider it, your textbook does not consider that a maximum point because there's nothing to the left of it. You have to have points to the right and to the left that it's higher than. So the only number we get from this is that we have a minimum point at 4.6 negative 26. And that's all we get from that graph. Okay, this looks like it stops up here also, but notice that goes on forever. If I change my window, it would just keep going higher and higher. Okay, so all we have for this is an absolute minimum. So for maximums, we have none, and I would just go ahead and put that on my answer. No maximum points at all. All right, here's another one. This time we're looking at a square root function. So again, I'm going to pull up my calculator, and we're going to graph that function. I'll move it for a second so you can see it. So we're graphing the square root of 25 minus x squared. Again, if you're using an online calculator, for square root you put SQRT, at least for this one, stands for square root. And then make sure you put in parentheses the 25 minus x to the second power parenthesis. Okay, and I hit enter and it will graph my function for me. Okay, so that's kind of a funny looking function. I'm going to change my window back so that it doesn't look quite so flat and I can kind of identify the points better. Okay, so here's my graph, just kind of a little dome shape that goes from negative 5 over here to 5 over here. Again, our job here is to find maximum and minimum points. So I definitely have a maximum point here. It's not just a relative maximum where it's higher than the points around it, it's an absolute maximum. Nothing else on the graph goes higher than that point, which happens to be at 0, 5. Okay, and we don't just label as absolute, it's also a relative maximum. Okay, so it's higher than the points around it, and it's the very highest point on the graph. Do we have any minimum points? Well, again, you might be tempted to label this point here and this point here as minimum points. Okay, the problem and the reason we cannot do that is because, again, your textbook defines a relative minimum as a point that's lower than all of the points to the left and to the right of it. So there's points to the right of this point, but there's nothing to the left. It just stops here. So we cannot call it a minimum. Same over here. Okay, there's nothing to the right of it. So based on your textbook definition, this cannot be a minimum point, one of our relative maximum or minimum. So really, all we have here, we had an absolute and relative minimum at the 0.05 maximum, I'm saying that wrong. For minimum points, there were none. There was no relative and there was no absolute. Okay, let's take a look at this very last graph. Okay, so here it is. I'm going to pull up my graphing calculator. I'm going to reset it so that we can put a new graph on there. And I'm going to type in my function. So this time I have x times, so I'm going to put x and then square root. Parenthesis, 25 minus x to the second power, parenthesis. And look at that shape that I get. Okay, again, it looks like my window's a little small. There's a peak here and a peak here, or a change there that I can't see. So I'm going to just make this a little bigger. I'm going to go from negative 15 to positive 15 on my y's. Okay, that's a better look at the graph. So again, we're looking for maximum and minimum values. Again, this endpoint here does not count as a minimum because there's nothing to the right of it for it to be. And this does not count as a maximum because there's nothing to the left of it. There have to be points on both sides of it. However, right here, notice we have a minimum point. Is it just relative or is it a absolute? Is it just, it is lower than the points around it. It's also lower than all of the points on the graph. So it's a relative minimum and it's the absolute minimum also. And that looks like it's about at the point negative 3.5, negative 12.5. I'm going to write that down while I have it. Okay, and again, that was a minimum point. It was not only a relative minimum, it was also absolute. Okay, next, let's see what else we have on our graph. So we had our minimum point here. Notice as we go up here, we hit a peak. This is the highest point on the graph, making it the absolute maximum point. It's also a relative maximum point. It's higher than all the points around it, but it's also the very highest point. And it looks like it's at about 3.5, positive 12.5. Okay, so not only is it a relative maximum, it's also the absolute maximum. And I apologize for my terrible handwriting. Okay, so there we have it. Double check your graph to make sure we didn't miss anything. We did get this minimum point, we did get this maximum point, and we know we can't count this one as a minimum because there's nothing to the right of it. And we can't count this as a maximum because there's nothing to the left of it. So we have identified all of the extrema on that graph.